He wasn't trying to be brave. He was trying to understand why the numbers didn't match what everyone believed. At 25,000 feet, where decisions shrink to seconds, one tail gunner noticed something no briefing ever mentioned. The enemy wasn't faster, stronger, or smarter. They were simply arriving before the system allowed a response. So he made a choice no one authorized. He fired earlier than he was supposed to. Not to kill, but to interrupt. What followed didn't look like heroism. It looked like confusion. Fighters breaking formation, attack patterns collapsing, outcomes shifting by margins no one could explain. And somewhere far from the sky, in reports no one expected to question, a pattern quietly began to form. One that suggested the system itself might be the most dangerous thing in the air. If this kind of story pulls you in, hit like and subscribe, because what happened next didn't just challenge a rule, it forced an entire war machine to rethink how it survived. The rule had a logic that felt undeniable, which is why no one thought to question it for so long. In training rooms far from the noise of engines and the unpredictability of combat, instructors explained that restraint was survival. Wait until the target closed within 300 yards. Aim carefully. Fire in controlled bursts. Conserve ammunition for the long mission ahead. On paper, it balanced mathematics and discipline, turning limited resources into sustained defense. The aircraft carried a fixed number of rounds, and every bullet spent too early was a risk calculated against unknown threats, still hours away. Command structures reinforced it, reports supported it, and generations of gunners repeated it without modification. But the rule depended on one fragile assumption: that the enemy would behave predictably, that they would allow distance to shrink on equal terms, that timing would be shared. None of those assumptions held once the sky filled with aircraft moving at closing speeds that collapsed seconds into fractions. German pilots didn't wait for symmetry. They attacked from beyond the expected range, opening fire earlier, forcing damage before American gunners even engaged. The doctrine, built for efficiency, unintentionally created a delay, a small window where hesitation became vulnerability. That delay wasn't visible in training diagrams, but it was measurable in outcomes: damaged tails, lost aircraft, crews that never had time to respond. Still, the system didn't see a failure. It saw adherence. Reports listed ammunition counts, not missed opportunities. They tracked discipline, not timing errors. The structure rewarded those who followed instructions precisely, even when those instructions quietly increased risk. Changing that kind of system required more than evidence. It required someone to act against it without permission. Yet from the system's perspective, deviation looked like a threat. A gunner who fired early wasn't innovative. He was inefficient, unpredictable, potentially dangerous to mission planning. If too many adopted that behavior, calculations about ammunition distribution, engagement timing, and defensive coverage would collapse. The rule wasn't just guidance. It was a foundation holding together thousands of coordinated decisions. And foundations resist change, especially when they appear to function. What no one accounted for was how a single shift in timing could ripple outward, altering not just one engagement, but the behavior of every pilot approaching that formation. The doctrine assumed a static enemy, but the enemy adapted faster than the system could respond. By the summer of 1943, that gap had widened into something subtle but lethal, a mismatch between what was taught and what was happening. The system continued to produce gunners who waited, and the sky continued to reward those who didn't. No official directive acknowledged the discrepancy. No immediate correction followed, because the evidence was scattered across missions, buried in after-action reports, diluted by variables no one had isolated. From a distance, everything still looked controlled. Up close, the pattern was different. Each engagement followed the rule, and each outcome carried a small cost that rarely traced back to its source. The system was not failing loudly. It was drifting quietly, and in that quiet drift, the difference between acting a few seconds earlier or later wasn't theoretical. It was the difference between interrupting an attack or absorbing it. The rule remained unchanged, not because it was perfect, but because no single voice had yet connected the consequences into something undeniable. Until that happened, the system would continue doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect its structure, even if that structure no longer matched reality. Before the war assigned him a weapon, he had already trained himself to notice things most people ignored. Michael Aruth had never been the kind of man who reacted first. He watched, measured, and adjusted. In civilian life, that habit came from routine tasks that demanded timing more than strength, tracking moving objects, estimating distance without instruments, recognizing patterns in motion that repeated just enough to be predictable. None of it was labeled as combat skill, and none of it appeared in any military manual, but it shaped how he processed what he saw once he was placed inside a machine designed around rules rather than observation. When he entered aerial gunnery training, he didn't struggle with accuracy or discipline. He struggled with something quieter: the disconnect between what he was told to expect and what he could already anticipate. The instructors emphasized patience, yet the scenarios they described felt incomplete to him, as if they assumed both sides were playing by the same timing. Aruth didn't see it that way. He noticed that an aircraft approaching from behind wasn't just closing distance. It was committing to a path, reducing its own flexibility in exchange for a firing opportunity. That commitment created a window, not at the moment it reached the prescribed range, but several seconds earlier, when its trajectory was already locked in. The system defined that earlier moment as irrelevant, but to him, it looked like the only moment that mattered. He didn't frame it as defiance. He framed it as adjustment. The same way he would have corrected an estimate that didn't match reality during his early missions. He followed the rule exactly as instructed, not because he believed in it fully, but because deviation carried consequences beyond himself. Each engagement reinforced the same pattern he had sensed during training. Enemy aircraft began influencing the situation before the system allowed him to respond. The delay was small, almost invisible, but it repeated with enough consistency that it stopped feeling like coincidence. What unsettled him wasn't fear of the enemy. It was the realization that the system he depended on was built around an assumption that no longer held. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It built gradually, through observation rather than instruction, until it reached a point where continuing to follow the rule felt less like discipline and more like ignoring available information. He wasn't trying to prove anything, and he wasn't trying to stand out. He was trying to reconcile two versions of reality, the one defined by the system and the one unfolding in front of him at closing speeds that left no room for hesitation. The difference between those two realities was measured in seconds, but those seconds carried consequences that extended far beyond a single engagement. If he adjusted his timing, even slightly, it could change how an approaching pilot reacted, forcing a decision earlier than expected. That shift wouldn't just affect one moment. It could alter the sequence of actions that followed, redirecting attention, breaking coordination, and creating outcomes the system had never accounted for. The question wasn't whether he was allowed to make that adjustment. The question was whether continuing to ignore it was a greater risk. And by the time that question became unavoidable, the system still had no mechanism to answer it. The mission over Castle did not begin as a test, but it became one the moment conditions stopped matching expectations. The formation pushed deeper into contested airspace, engines steady, structure intact, every crew member operating within a system that had been repeated enough times to feel automatic. Behind that structure, however, timing was already shifting. When the first interceptors appeared, they didn't approach as the training scenarios had predicted. They committed early, accelerating into attack paths that compressed distance faster than the rule anticipated. Aruth saw the geometry unfold before the range matched what he had been taught to wait for. The aircraft closing behind him had already aligned itself, trading maneuverability for precision, and in that trade he recognized the same pattern he had been tracking for weeks. Waiting would mean allowing that alignment to complete. Acting earlier would force a reaction before the attack stabilized. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was measured in a fraction of a second, a quiet override of timing rather than authority. He engaged sooner than the system defined as optimal, sending fire into a space the rule considered premature. The immediate result wasn't destruction. It was disruption. The approaching pilot adjusted course earlier than expected, breaking alignment, losing the steady approach required for accurate fire. That single adjustment carried forward, altering the rhythm of the engagement. The next aircraft approached with hesitation, not because it had been hit, but because the pattern it expected was no longer reliable. Each deviation compounded the next, turning coordinated attacks into fragmented attempts that lacked the precision they depended on. Inside the aircraft, however, the effect looked different. Ammunition counters dropped faster than planned, and from the crew's perspective, the deviation introduced uncertainty rather than clarity. Questions followed the action, not understanding it yet. From the system's viewpoint, the cost was immediate and visible, resources being spent outside calculated limits, while the benefit remained intangible, expressed only through outcomes that could be attributed to multiple factors. As the engagement continued, Aruth maintained the adjusted timing, not out of confidence in being right, but because reverting to the original rule no longer aligned with what he was observing. Each early action forced another reaction, extending the disruption beyond a single encounter and into the broader behavior of the opposing pilots. What had begun as a personal adjustment was now influencing multiple decisions across the sky, none of which were coordinated with him, yet all responding to the same unexpected pressure. The system had not changed, but within it, a different sequence had started to unfold. One where timing, not volume, dictated control. By the time the formation reached its target and began the long return, the immediate danger had passed. But the implications of that shift had not yet been recognized. What remained was a record that would later appear inconsistent. Higher ammunition usage paired with outcomes that didn't match the expected risk. In the moment, it looked like inefficiency. In sequence, it would begin to look like something else entirely, a deviation that altered behavior not just once, but repeatedly, in ways the system had never measured. Weeks later, far from the noise of engines and the pressure of immediate decisions, the discrepancy began to surface where the system was supposed to be most reliable. Inside the records, Lieutenant Daniel Reeves, assigned to review mission reports for the 379th Bombardment Group, wasn't looking for innovation. He was looking for consistency. His job was to confirm that procedures were being followed and that outcomes aligned with expectations. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Flight paths matched, formations held, ammunition expenditures fell within acceptable ranges. But when he compared individual aircraft across multiple missions, a subtle inconsistency emerged. A small number of bombers showed a pattern that didn't align with the rest. They weren't returning untouched, but they were sustaining less critical damage, completing missions with fewer catastrophic failures than statistical models predicted. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to trigger immediate concern, yet it persisted across separate engagements, different routes, and varying levels of enemy resistance. Reeves initially considered environmental variables, weather conditions, escort timing, formation position, but none of them consistently explained the deviation. The anomaly remained, quiet but persistent, embedded within otherwise routine data. As he narrowed his focus, he began isolating individual gunners associated with those aircraft. That was where the pattern sharpened. Ammunition usage in these cases trended higher than average, sometimes significantly so, yet the outcome suggested improved survivability rather than increased risk. Within the system's logic, that combination didn't make sense. Higher expenditure was supposed to correlate with inefficiency, not improved results. Reeves cross-referenced after-action notes, gun camera summaries, and debrief transcripts, searching for a variable the system had not accounted for. What he found wasn't a new tactic documented in official reports. It was a repeated deviation, engagements beginning earlier than doctrine prescribed. No directive authorized it, no instructor endorsed it. Yet it appeared often enough to form a pattern. The gunners involved weren't coordinating with each other, and there was no centralized instruction guiding their behavior. Each instance looked isolated, but when viewed together, they pointed to a shared adjustment in timing. That adjustment didn't guarantee success in every engagement, but it consistently altered the sequence of events, forcing opposing pilots to react before establishing stable attack positions. From a system perspective, this created a conflict. The rule defined efficiency through conservation and controlled timing, but the data suggested that earlier action, previously classified as wasteful, might be influencing outcomes in a way the rule never considered. Reeves understood the implications, and they were uncomfortable. If the pattern held true, then the system wasn't just incomplete. It was reinforcing a behavior that reduced survivability under certain conditions. Presenting that conclusion required more than observation. It required challenging a framework that governed thousands of operations. Reports were structured to confirm compliance, not to question underlying assumptions. Any deviation risked being dismissed as anomaly rather than insight. Still, the numbers continued to argue, quietly but persistently, refusing to align with established expectations. Reeves compiled his findings carefully, framing them as discrepancies rather than conclusions. Aware that the system would resist any suggestion of fault, the evidence didn't accuse, it suggested. And in that suggestion lay a deeper tension. The possibility that a single, unapproved adjustment, repeated across different individuals, was beginning to reshape outcomes without ever being formally recognized. The system had not changed, but something within it had started to move differently, and the data was the only place where that movement could be seen. By early September, adaptation was no longer one-sided, and the system that had resisted change now faced pressure from both directions at once. The mission toward Stuttgart extended deeper than most previous operations, stretching timing, fuel calculations, and defensive assumptions across a longer corridor of hostile airspace. Interceptions began earlier, not as isolated attacks, but as coordinated sequences designed to exploit any inconsistency in formation behavior. German pilots had begun to notice something shifting. Their approach patterns were no longer producing the same predictable results. Some attacks came faster, reducing exposure time, while others shifted angles to avoid the zones where earlier disruption had been observed. The environment was no longer stable enough for any single method to dominate. Within the formation, the situation grew more complex. Not every gunner had adopted the same adjustment, and those who had did so, with varying degrees of timing and confidence, the system had not formally updated, which meant two different interpretations of engagement now existed simultaneously, creating a fragmented defensive response that lacked uniformity. In that fragmentation, coordination began to erode. Aruth entered the engagement carrying the same understanding he had built over previous missions. But the conditions had changed. Early action still disrupted individual attackers, yet the opposing force compensated by increasing frequency and variation, forcing him to manage not just timing but sequence under pressure. During one sustained engagement, incoming fire damaged part of his equipment, reducing his capacity to respond at full strength. The system he operated within had no provision for this combination: partial capability, reduced resources, and an environment already deviating from expected patterns. He adjusted again, this time not by acting earlier, but by refining when not to act, conserving what remained for moments where commitment from the opposing aircraft was unmistakable. That shift represented a second layer of deviation, one that required interpreting behavior under uncertainty rather than following any fixed rule. Around him, the consequences of inconsistency became visible. Aircraft within the same formation experienced different outcomes under similar conditions, not because of randomness, but because their responses were no longer synchronized. Some engagements were disrupted early, others allowed to develop fully, creating uneven pressure that the opposing force could exploit. The system, built on uniformity, struggled under conditions where variation had become unavoidable. As the mission progressed, structural damage accumulated across multiple aircraft, not always from direct failure, but from the compounded effect of partial disruptions that failed to align across the formation. Aruth continued operating within this shifting environment, balancing limited resources against the need to influence timing whenever possible. Each decision carried weight beyond its immediate result, affecting how subsequent attackers approached not just his aircraft, but others in proximity. The cascading effect of those decisions became harder to predict. as both sides adapted in real time without centralized coordination. By the time the formation turned back, the outcome did not present itself as a clear success or failure. Some aircraft failed to maintain formation integrity, others completed the mission under strain, and the overall result resisted simple classification. What emerged instead was a clearer view of the system's limitation. When adaptation occurred faster than formal updates, individuals were forced to operate between two frameworks, neither of which fully matched reality. In that space, decisions were no longer about following or breaking rules, but about navigating the gap between them. The system had begun to shift, but not quickly enough to stabilize the conditions it faced, and the cost of that delay was measured not in a single event, but across the accumulation of outcomes that no longer aligned with expectation. After the missions ended and the reports were filed, the system did what it always did. It tried to stabilize what no longer behaved the same way. Adjustments began to appear, not as dramatic reversals, but as cautious revisions to engagement guidelines, allowing flexibility where rigidity had once been enforced. The language remained careful, almost reluctant, as if acknowledging change without admitting error. No single name was attached to the shift, no moment officially marked as the turning point. Instead, it emerged through accumulation, through enough small deviations producing results that could no longer be ignored. Aruth did not stand at the center of that recognition. By the time the system began to incorporate what had once been considered deviation, his role had already changed. Injuries and accumulated strain removed him from sustained combat, placing him in positions where experience was transferred rather than tested. In that transition, something subtle occurred. What he had discovered through observation became instruction, but without the context that had forced it into existence. New gunners learned to act earlier, to adjust timing, yet many never experienced the conditions that made such decisions necessary. The system absorbed the behavior, but not always the reasoning behind it. Meanwhile, the broader impact unfolded beyond any single individual. Missions began to show gradual shifts in survivability, not uniformly, not immediately, but enough to suggest that something fundamental had changed in how engagements were initiated. Enemy pilots adapted again, altering their approaches in response to earlier defensive pressure, proving that no adjustment remained effective indefinitely. What persisted was not a fixed tactic, but a change in how timing was understood, as something dynamic, not prescribed. The decision that began as a personal correction had traveled outward, influencing behavior across units, altering expectations on both sides of the conflict. Yet its origin remained diffuse, almost invisible within the scale of the system. There was no moment where the war paused to acknowledge that a single adjustment had redirected a sequence of events. Instead, the change blended into the continuous evolution of tactics, becoming part of a larger pattern that no longer resembled its original form. Looking back, the question is not whether the system eventually adapted. It did, but how long it took to recognize what had already been happening within it. If that initial deviation had never occurred, the system would have continued to operate within its original assumptions, producing outcomes that matched its design rather than reality. The cost of that delay cannot be measured precisely, because it exists in the difference between what happened and what might have happened instead. Some crews would have completed their missions regardless. Others would not. The line between those outcomes was not always drawn by skill or chance, but by timing, by whether someone acted within the rule or just outside it. The story does not resolve into a clear victory or a defined failure. It remains a sequence of adjustments, reactions, and consequences that extend beyond any single mission. What it reveals is less about combat and more about systems. The way they are built, the way they resist change, and the way they eventually adapt when reality forces them to. The lesson is not that one individual changed everything, but that a system can continue functioning while quietly producing the wrong outcomes, and that recognizing the difference requires more than obedience. It requires attention, interpretation, and the willingness to act on information that has not yet been validated. Sometimes the most critical decisions are not the ones that follow the system, but the ones that reveal where the system no longer fits the world it is meant to operate in.